Hello and welcome to week 4, Metadata Schemas. We are going to be talking about schemas this week specifically, and we'll dive in a little tiny bit more into XML because those two things have a relationship. As always, pay attention to the dates. Work is scaffolded in this class, so what you do in assignment 1, 2, and 3 is going to be the foundation for what you do in your final assignment, as you probably know by now. Syllabus highlights, just to kind of set the stage for where we are. We're talking about metadata schemas and frameworks. Those two terms are kind of interchangeable in terms of how things work together. A metadata schema is very, in the most general sense, a list of elements and best practices. And that's really as simple as it gets. Once you start organizing it and there's relationships between the data and you're maybe defining required and mandatory fields and maybe optional fields or obsolete or do not use fields, which sometimes we need to go that direction as well, then you start getting to the framework piece of it. So that's the difference in a very simple way between a metadata schema and a framework. And then, of course, we have the controlled vocabulary piece of it. And the controlled vocabulary piece of it are the terms that we then put into our schema framework. These are the terms that we use to describe the resources that we are creating metadata about. So I'll show you this in a couple of different presentations. I wanted to kind of help provide a visual that breaks that down a little bit more in terms of structure standards. So thinking about the structure of the data in terms of the overall structure of the data, some examples of that. Dublin Core, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. Mods, we're going to talk a little bit about today. RDA and ISBD can kind of fall into that category for names and types of entries because those are structured fields. If you're a cataloger who's working with that kind of stuff, you probably know what that means, but it has to do with the MARC metadata. MARC is a little bit, we talked about this already, it is a little bit of an oddity because it's kind of two things at once. It's both a structure standard and it's an encoding standard. So it actually falls into two categories and why it's on two categories. So you can think of the encoding standard as the formatting, the machine readability. This is your file formats. So it has more to it besides the file format, but the file format has associated with it an encoding standard that helps the system make sense of that particular file. The structure standard, which is what we're going to be looking at today, that's really the schema, and that's the structure of the data. So how those two things fit together, we have a file format, and the file format itself has some information about the type of file format, so the computer can understand how to read that particular file. You know, just like with a JPEG, what do we use to open a JPEG? What kind of software opens a JPEG, or what kind of software opens a Word document? All of that's controlled by that encoding information that's kind of on the back end that we don't typically engage with because we just click and it opens and it works, right? Most of the time. The structure standard is then for us working with metadata, that is then the structure of the data. So when we are working with describing resources and working with these systems, there is a structure actually associated with that. And we can think of this also as fields. So if you have looked at or you've worked with some kind of software before, it could be WordPress, it could be Drupal, it could be your library catalog, it could be an institutional repository software, it could be museum software. If it has fields, or it could be a work form that you filled out on the web. So, you put your name in and your address and things like that. Those fields and how those fields are defined, that's the structure standard. That's the schema piece of it. So although we don't always think of it that way, and we don't talk about when we're creating, say, a work form, maybe we're going to ask people to sign up for a newsletter, or we're going to ask people to recommend something or to fill out a survey. We don't usually think of those fields as being a schema, but they are a schema. They're probably not as really a framework because they don't have a lot associated with them. It's just, name, maybe name, title, whatever other information we're collecting from people. But those are those fields, by the fact that they are defined for that particular project, they are actually kind of a schema. So there's lots of things that fall into the schema category, even beyond what we think of. But we're focused on the data piece of it. So because we're focused on the data piece of it, we're going to be talking about the most common things that you might find out in the metadata landscape. The other thing I want to say about this list is far from comprehensive. If you look at the metadata registry or any of these other lists of metadata schemas out there, there are hundreds, probably more than hundreds, probably thousands actually, if it's across the whole web. Different communities of practice have different kinds of schemas. And so if you're looking at a particular format, or you're looking at a particular type of content in your collection and in your project, you may look at Dublin Core. Dublin Core is very general, and you may think, well, that's not really going to work for me. My collection is very specific, and it's a niche market, and it's a niche subject. So I want to see if I can find something that would better address my particular subject. That's fine. This is not a you have to pick off this list. This is just a list of some of the ones that you might encounter when you go out and you start looking at metadata schemas. And the same sort of thing when we start talking over here on the down at the bottom on the value standards where our vocabularies live. I've only put just a very small list there. Certainly there's many more vocabularies out there besides that. So, there's much more beyond what I just kind of put in this diagram. I just threw some examples in. That's really all it's for, to kind of break these concepts into a visual. So we have our structure standards, that's our schemas. We have our content standards, and this is our best practices or rules for how we do this work. So if you come from MARC cataloging, AACR2 or RDA, Resource Description Access is what RDA stands for. AACR2 is Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, 2nd edition. Yes, it's a terrible name. That's why one of the reasons why we got rid of that. So, but that was before RDA. But if you are a person working with that kind of metadata, those may be things that you're familiar with as best practices or rules. Sometimes we call things rules, sometimes we call them guidelines, sometimes we call them best practices. Really, best practices is probably the most accurate term, because we are always adapting. Even if it's rules, we may not be able to apply those rules fully in our software, or we may, want to use maybe a subset of the rules, or there may be some part of the rules that we feel are contributing to bias or contributing in some way to something that's not going to be useful for our community. So we may choose to not include those part of the rules. So we're always making those judgment calls when we're working with our rules. So even in the most firmly entrenched rules, we probably still have a little bit of room to make decisions, and they really then are more best practices. We'll talk more about those as we go along. We're not going to talk too much about content standards and rules in this particular class, because the rules that you use for how you describe resources, those are really after you've made your decision about your metadata schema. It would be after you've made your decision about your controlled vocabulary. Those best practices or rules would be how you then apply those things. So you would be looking at your whole thing. You'd be looking at your project that you have, the scope of what's in your project. You might be looking at the software to make some evaluation in terms of how best to apply these rules, and which rules maybe your software requires certain rules, like library catalog and ILS type of integrated library system type of software often require either AACR2 or RDA as the rules for applying the various work that we do with metadata. So sometimes the systems themselves drive these conversations. And that's true with metadata schemas, and it's also true with vocabularies, and it's also true with encoding standards and file formats. There are some of the software that are out there that are going to be Dublin core only. That's the only thing that they're going to use, or maybe it's Dublin core or something else, or maybe you can create your own schema, but it's going to be a very limited list in terms of what you can do. For the purposes of assignment for this class, if you have a real project, it's something that you're working on, it's a real collection, and you know what software is being used for that collection or will be used for that collection, then I think it's fine to kind of take that into account. It's certainly not something you have to worry about for the purposes of this class. It would be something that when you are writing your recommendation, so you're writing sort of that final report at the end, thinking about how you would tell someone about this kind of metadata project and how you would kind of sell this to them, then that would be one of the things to take into account, is how flexible the schemas that you've chosen, the vocabularies you've chosen, and are there additional requirements from the software, or that would be something to be aware of and to take into consideration. So if your recommendation, for example, is to use mods for your schema, then one of the things you might write somewhere, either in the schema discussion or when you do your final presentation and pull things together, is just a little blurb or two about different software, and you might even be making a recommendation for a software if you've seen something out there that uses mods and you think, wow, that would be great. Or you may just say something about, this is the best choice for this particular collection, but depending upon what software is used, it may or may not be the best choice, or something like that. That needs a little bit of wordsmithing, but you get the idea. So another presentation of the same concept here. So metadata standards, metadata structure standards. This one has Dublin core, mods, VAR core, MARC, AACR2, ISBD up there, RDA elements at a high level, and then EAD elements, and then metadata content standards, rules, guidelines, best practices. This is everything I just talked about. Metadata value standards, controlled vocabularies for the values of the elements. I think those are all the same. Well, I listed authority, so a little bit of difference there. Metadata presentation standards, and then metadata encoding standards. And again, those are things that we just talked about there. So thinking a little bit more about the metadata standards and how things fit together, I did want to kind of, for those of you who are starting to do some of this work for your collections, you may want to take a look at these. This is a really nice graphic. It's not mine. Unfortunately, I do not know who created it, so I cannot give them credit, but it is a good breakdown of some things to look at depending upon what the scope of your project may be. So for example, if you have a project that's based in the social sciences, then you might want to take a look at the data documentation initiative. That may or may not be something that ends up being of interest to you, but it would be something to perhaps take a look at. If you're doing something that's natural history, certainly you can look at something in the humanities like TEI. VRA core is really going to be more for visual arts and graphic design and museum kind of things. But depending upon what you have in your natural history collection, there may be things that would fall into that category, so you might want to take a look at that too. So diving into what metadata standards and best practices and what schemas really are. So schemas really are, I think the easiest way to think of it in my book is to think of it as an element set. From a web view of it, it is a set of semantic properties. And then we use that to describe the resources. Now we're describing the resources at an element level, not at the verbs or words or content level. The content that goes into these. So that's why I think field is such an good way to describe this, is because when we put information into that field, that would be what would be controlled by our best practices for application or controlled by our controlled vocabularies. For example, if we have a field that's subject, so we have an element that is a subject, then our choice of a subject would come from our controlled vocabulary. Or if we don't have a controlled vocabulary for that project, then our subject just may be free text and it's just going to be a keyword. Some projects do mix schemas and encoding standards under one umbrella. As you're probably starting to notice, things get a little bit blurry between some of these different things. And that's partially because of how they were developed and when they were developed. So we've already talked about MARC being a mix of file format, so file format, encoding standard, and a metadata schema. So it's kind of two things together. And it's not truly even a metadata schema and how we think about metadata schemas now, but it's sort of a precursor to one, I suppose. But it fits into that bucket as well as fitting into a file format encoding schema. TEI is another one where it mixes the metadata schema and then encoding standards together. So you do have sometimes this mix of things. And, I think one of the reasons that we have metadata schemas as opposed to not having a schema, I don't really know what the option would be here to not have a schema. I guess it would just all be free text. Everything in our record would just be free text. But it's meant to help ensure that our data is interoperable, that it's persistent, and there's the user and system access to the metadata. So the metadata is there. It's not only there, it can be accessed, there can be actions taken upon it. It can be used for searching, retrieval, all that kind of stuff. To facilitate the metadata interchange, this could be transferability, so it could be data migration. Metadata standards in these schemas are incredibly important when you start doing data migrations or ingesting. So when you start going out to other projects and pulling in data from other resources, being able to have data that is consistent and the elements are consistent so that you can map, and we'll talk more about mapping in a couple of weeks from now. We'll talk more about mapping, but to be able to have that information transfer is really important. It's just, especially when you get to large volumes of data. If you just have like 10 records and it would be all free text, you could kind of figure it out and figure out maybe what the title was and things like that just out of the text itself. But once you start getting a scale and volume of data, it becomes much more challenging to do that. It also can help support long-term metadata viability. Knowing that something is in a Dublin Core framework and is in an XML file format, then can make it easier to transfer the data into something else should that system become obsolete. But we also have sort of a documented framework and best practices for those. And we can then take that to use that to create mappings and to do all kinds of things to help preserve that metadata. So let's look at EAD mods. Oh, I got mods on there twice, sorry. Let's look at EAD mods, Dublin Core and VAR Core. EAD is encoding archival description, and this is a standard for electronic encoding of finding aids. And we typically use finding aids the most for archival and manuscript collections, but they can really be used for anything. It is It does use XML, so that's the encoding standard, and we'll talk a little bit more about XML at the end of today's session. So one of the things I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about is finding aids versus metadata description, because it's not really so much part of this class, but it is an important part of our work. And I see that people get really confused about what the difference between these two things are and when you would use one over the other. So a finding aid is really going to focus on access. So that's probably the key part of it, is to focus on access. The second part of a finding aid that is really critical, I think, is that it's focusing at a collection level. So finding, I mean, that's pretty obvious what that term would mean for us. And then aid and assistance to being able to find things. So it focuses on access to be able to direct people to resources, but by the nature of how these resources are sometimes boxed up or collected, or say put into a file folder if it's digital content, focusing on the access at that collection level. For metadata description, if we want to, sometimes we do pull finding aid records and put them into the library catalog or put them into another resource, because sometimes that's the only access we have to that particular resource. So let's say you have a collection of letters. I've given you my collection of letters, and there's 5,000 in a file folder. They're all digital. So there are 5,000 in a file folder. It's going to take a while to get through those 5,000 letters. So in the meantime, and you do want people to be able to find them as a collection to see all of Robin Fay's wonderful letters that she writes. So you could create the finding aid record, one that could be done a little bit more quicker because you're just doing the one record and you describe the collection as a whole. So that would at least get people to that collection. Then if we wanted to, and this really varies upon institution to institution, if they go in and actually catalog and create individual resource descriptions, descriptive metadata for, say, individual letters. Now, it depends sometimes on collection. If you have a collection that's mixed and maybe it has some letters in it and it has some photographs in it and it has some just various things from a person's desk, the paperweight and their calendar and a few other things like that, then you may want to go in and do each of the different formats, or maybe there are things in there that have intrinsic value that is much greater than some of the other things in there. There's a book in there that's been signed by someone famous, and so you would want to highlight or feature that out of the collection. So there's different ways of approaching the resource description part of it and how deep you want to go in terms of the resource description. But the finding aid is typically meant to be at the collection level and to focus on getting access to people. You can also think of it as being a guide or an inventory of the content. So a lot of times a good finding aid will tell you that, there's a paperweight in there, there's a book signed by someone famous, there's 15 letters, that kind of thing. It's going to go through the list, but it's not going to go in and give subjects to each one of those resources. And it's not going to be a full description of each resource. It's going to be a summary of that collection. So types of information collected, we've already talked about some of these. Typically, they'll have a collection number or collection name. They'll have the creator name. They'll have the type. And we've already talked some about some of the kinds of typed things. Date range, so there'll be some attempt to give it a date range. And then things depends upon the software, but a lot of times the finding aid author, so whoever created that particular finding aid will appear in that. Information, and this is getting more to the archival part of it, but information about how the institution acquired that resource, and then processing information. So if there's any kind of packaging of that content that happened, or any kind of special handling that occurred, or preservation that occurred, or anything that would change the status of that particular resource, or restrictions on access, or any of that kind of stuff. It all goes into the finding aid, especially for physical materials, but also for digital, but really for physical, because of course materials take up space and real estate in institutions. They will very much cover the number of containers and often how many linear feet that those resources take up. And then you have things that overlap with what we might include in description, but they're going to be, again, at the collection level. So we'll give some kind of summary or abstract, a little bit about what that collection contains. We might include a biography or history, collection scope and content. So we'll talk a little bit more, which this is sort of what you're doing, what you did for week 1, where you're talking about what your collection scope is and the content there. So the same sort of thing goes into a finding aid, because you're talking about it at a collection level. And then there can be other information, like whether or not materials have been separated and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, there'll be sometimes, not always, but there will be subjects assigned, again, at that collection level. Now, that's not, again, at the individual item level that's in the collection. It's going to be typically at the collection level. We've already talked about access. Sometimes there'll be preferred citations. You see this a lot with digital content, especially when it'll have some preferred citations. Related material, if there are other collections that are related in some way, there will be information about that. Container box information, of course, if it's physical materials, languages that are represented, and locations. So it's meant to register the content of an archival collection. And as we can see just in that little list there, it contains a lot of narrative text. And we've already talked about it being a tool to assist in finding resources, but that's hopefully you get a sense a little bit of the distinction between what a finding aid is and what a resource description or individual record would be. You can have, of course, individual records for things that are in a collection that are represented by a finding aid, but they're typically going to be related records, but they may even reside in different software. So you may have archive space, and we're going to look at an example of archive space in a minute. You may have archive space for your finding aids, and those records then go into your institutional repository or into your catalog or into your website. And then you have resource description records, descriptive metadata records for the individual resources. Now, in an ideal world, we can connect all those relationships between the data together so that it's really easy for people to find the collection and finding aid, and then be able to find the records and data for the individual resources within that. But unfortunately, that is not always the case. In an ideal world, yes. Unfortunately, in practicing sort of the real world, a lot of times we're talking about proprietary systems and all that kind of stuff. And there's just, we have to work really hard to try to facilitate the relationships between those kind of things. Benefits of an EAD finding aid. It documents the interrelated description of an archival finding aid. It preserves the hierarchy of relationships between levels of description. It can also represent descriptive information. If you have different levels and relationships of data, it can represent that fairly well. And it does support element-specific indexing. So the elements that appear in EAD can be used for searching and retrieval of descriptive information. So if you have a finding aid record and you import it into your, say, your repository that uses Dublin Core, the search mechanism should be able to search across both of those in theory. One of the most common software we use for finding aids are archive space. Why create finding aids? There's a lot of different reasons. If you use finding aids or you create finding aids, you probably have your own reasons why, but they are useful, especially for creating guides and inventories to archival and manuscript collections. They do facilitate searching at a collection level, and they can also help provide access to digital content if it's in a collection. Because they're typically not as many records, being a collection level record, it can be easier to maintain the data. But again, then being at a collection level, you don't get the granularity of the individual resources. In theory, I feel like it'd be good to have both a finding aid for the collection and then to create that descriptive metadata for the individual resources. So as we go through examples of these metadata schemas, do think about how the structure of the data is represented. And remember, when we're looking at these examples, the descriptive terms, and this would be like the subjects, those are the vocabularies. So you could even revisit some of these slides when we are talking about vocabularies next week, because you will be seeing vocabularies in some of these examples as well. So here's an example of a finding aid, and we see up at the top that it has tag name, and the tag name appears in those little brackets. And then it has the element name, and in this case, the element name's quantity. So we could think of the tag name as, well, being the data tag. The element name would be what appears to the public. So in this case, we have quantity. That would be sort of the behind the scenes name or label that we would see. And then the element name quantity would be what the public would see or would display to the public. Sometimes they're the same as in this example, and sometimes they're not. So maybe we decided, maybe our tag name said extent, and we thought that doesn't make sense to most of our patrons. They're not really going to understand what that means. So maybe we'll call it physical description. So the tag name can be one thing and the element name can be something else. And then in this case, we have summary. So we're looking at kind of going down. So we're looking at our element name of quantity. And then we have summary, and there's a little bit of information to get to that aspect of the summary then. So just a little bit of information and kind of a breakdown in terms of how the information is recorded and what that information means. So for example, for quantity, for our element of quantity, we have that description kind of telling us briefly what it is. We have some information about what may be included here, and then what attributes we may include. And under our attributes, we have for example, approximate, audience, encoding, analog, some other things as well. And they're listed as optional, which means they are not required. They're not required for inclusion in creating this finding aid. So that value of whether or not something is optional or not in the metadata schema is, that's really getting to the best practice piece of it. So when we have a metadata schema, how we interpret and decide what's going to be optional or not is getting to some best practices. So then there's a little bit more information. So this is telling us all kinds of things about how we would use the element quantity. So we also have, for quantity, we have a description of how we use it, that it is it should be a number, and that the use of quantity enables extent statements to be machine processable. So it's saying that it is going to allow the machine to see that value as a number and to be able to do something with it. And we see in our references, we see mark listed. So that means that there's probably something in place behind the scenes for this to mark this particular element, to mark it in, map it into mark, that it would say quantity needs to go into a 300 field, or quantity needs to go into an extent field. So looking at the archives piece of things and kind of how things fit, we can kind of see some of the elements just when we look at something from a public standpoint. Now, again, what appears on the public side in terms of the labels for particular elements doesn't necessarily match what's on the staff side of things, but we can still, putting our metadata hats on, we can still look at public resources, and we can usually pick out or start picking out or examining them through our metadata lens. We can start picking out where those elements would be. So for example, subject. So archive space, we have a subject element. We have an element that represents the subject. Now the terms that appear in the subject, this long list that's under subject, those terms are the controlled vocabulary piece. So subject does not tell us anything about which vocabulary to use. Now, as our best practice, we may decide what vocabulary to use. So if I am implementing archive space and I'm looking at the element set that's available, I may decide that subject is required, and I may decide that subject is Library of Congress subject headings. Those decisions I've made are my best practice for how I'm going to apply and use that element. The software may also require things as well. So the software may just say, well, Library of Congress subject headings are nothing. And if that's the case, then your decision's been made for you. So this is one of these examples where the software does drive how we use elements, and it does drive even our choice of controlled vocabularies. For the purpose, again, for the purpose of what you're doing for your assignment, you may or may not know or have any idea what the software will be. So don't worry about that piece of it. You can just develop your metadata or decide on your metadata schema, decide on your controlled vocabulary, make the choices you need to make for the best practices for your particular project. If you do have a real project and you know what that particular project would use as software, or what it does use as software, then certainly you can use that to help guide your choices. But that doesn't mean that you have to go out and do like a big software survey or anything like that. I'm not asking for that. We're just looking at a collection and the metadata pieces of it. But the software, unfortunately, so many times drives our choices in terms of what we can do. And it is truly incredibly limiting in the real world. When you install software and you start looking at software, you are limited to what you can choose a lot of times with controlled vocabularies and with metadata schemas. And that's true with MARC too, although more recently we have added more fields and subfields so that we can include alternate vocabularies. But that was not true for years and years and years. For a long time, we were very limited in what we could choose as a controlled vocabulary. And we can't change the MARC fields. We can choose different ones in some systems, but then if your system doesn't index and display it, it doesn't allow it to be searched. Then if you're putting data into those particular MARC fields or elements, is it worth the value to do so? Maybe if you're sort of future proofing your data and you're putting data in there for what you expect your next system to do, then I would say that's probably worthwhile. And if you're doing something that is, looking to what the community as a whole, your community, whichever one it may be, what it's looking as the future of data, then I would say that might be a worthwhile effort, and probably is. If you're adding in data that is obsolete, but maybe it works well in your old system, then I think that's a really serious conversation to start having, because your system's then pushing you back to using sort of antiquated processes. Anyway, let's see, what else do we want to talk about here? Another example, this is the work form for archive space. So we see their title, We see that there's a reference ID there and it says it's auto-generated upon save. So sometimes there are things in the work form that we are not creating ourselves that are created by the system, and reference ID is one of them. We have additional information here, and one of the nice things about some repository software as well as archive space is there is the ability to have drop down, so you don't have to type everything in. You can choose just from a drop down menu. If we look on the left side, we see that there's information about there's dates, there's extents, there's agent links, there's subjects. So we can kind of work our way down this object representation or this work form by opening and closing these various element groups to kind of fully create that record for the collection. This is an example of extent. So opening up the extent tab there, it gives us, we have information where we put in information about the box. Again, the reference ID has already been created at that point. We have a level of description where you can choose from the record group that exists for that, and a little bit more information as we go along. So it will allow us to put a little bit more information in as far as that goes. We already looked at sort of some examples at the front or search interface, but then this is what a finding a display looks like. So searching for Melville Haggerty. There's one collection or record, and we can just see here it says papers. It's a collection. There's an overview of the collection and a little bit more information about what is found in. Now, if we click on that, there's going to be more of a description and things like that. So there's a little bit more information about it, but it's not a real robust record. So EAD is a way to create and structure finding aids. Archivist Toolkit, which is, I think it's still kind of kicking, or was still kicking around as a open source project out there that had still existed on GitHub, but I think it's been completely or almost completely replaced by archive space these days. But I know there were some libraries still using Archivist Toolkit just recently, but I'm not sure how they were doing it. So Archivist Toolkit was originally what it was, and then it became Archive Space. And then for the individual records or description of these resources, then we would look to something else like MODS, Dublin Core, MARC, something like that. So MODS is Metadata Object Description Schema. It was developed by the Library of Congress. It has been around for a long time now. It was recently, in the last couple of years, has been revised and updated. So it still has development work that's occurring. I feel like it kind of comes and goes in popularity, where it seems like it sort of has a resurgence, and then it sort of seems like it dies off and it comes back. At this point, it's a standard. It's been around for a long time. It is XML based, so the file format's XML. It is meant for descriptive metadata, and it's based upon, or really came out of, the MARC community. So this came out of libraries, Library of Congress, came out of libraries, and it's not entirely a derivative of MARC, but it is really, MARC was sort of the inspiration and the starting point for it. So it was looking at MARC to see how MARC could be used in different ways. So, for example, instead of using MARC numerical tags like 245, it uses title. So it uses language-based tags. It does contain a subset, so it does contain some MARC data elements. And it also does what it can to repackage elements to reduce redundancies. It does not, now, just like with EAD and archive space, it does not assume the use of any specific rules for description. So what those best practices are, what's required, not what's not, how do you record a title, what controlled vocabulary, that's the best practices piece of it. And those are a very important piece of the metadata work. So it's all of these things kind of fitting together. Mods, here's the high level of elements. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but title, name, type of resource, classification. So we get to this would be numbers or Library of Congress subject heading or subject, sorry, Library of Congress classification or Dewey Decimal number, that kind of thing, NLM number. So it does have places to put almost all of the sort of traditional MARC information. Now, MODS is not just used by libraries, and it's not just used through this MARC lens. So, these terms here, the elements, are things that a lot of different projects could use. And MODS does have a little bit wider application, especially when you start looking in the digital humanities and institutional repository communities. You see a little bit more implementation there. Dublin Core has a tendency to be, I would say, and we're going to look at the end of today's session, I would say it has a tendency to be more widely used, and I'm not really sure why, except if you have a project that's completely outside of libraries, then things like classification and location, meaning location like in the building or, like where the object is physically located kind of thing, not the geographic location of the place that it may be about the description, but what building it's in or what floor it's on or any of that kind of stuff. The only thing I could really think is that maybe this has felt too library-esque for a lot of other communities. But I do find it interesting that MODS works really well as sort of an intermediary between MARC. So you can take MARC, convert it to MARC XML, and then you can convert it over to MODS fairly easily. And that will give you some metadata that's a little bit more compatible with other projects. But it's just not as widely used as I would have thought it would be. We'll talk a little bit about it in terms of how it works with METs, but it can work with METs. And we're going to talk about METs in just a minute here. It can be used to represent metadata for harvesting, and the Open Archives Initiative, which is what OAI stands for, that's a harvesting protocol. So it's typically using either XML or APIs, and you're able to, if you have a protocol set up to allow harvesting and you have the protocol set up on your side, so you kind of have to have your protocol set up, and the institution that you want to harvest from has to have their protocol set up. If you have that kind of compatibility between the two, then it is useful for being able to harvest or collect data and resources from other sources. The language-based tags are certainly more user-friendly because you don't have to know what all the numbers mean as if you were looking at a MARC record, and it's also a simplified set. It does use it can use as a specified XML format for search retrieval by your URL, and search retrieval by URL is like an API thing. So it is a way to be able to get to a data stream to be able to do harvesting. Let's see, we already talked a little bit about the ability to work between MARC and non-MARC. It is richer than Dublin Core, so there's more granularity here, and of course this is just the high level I've given you, but there's a little bit more granularity here because it is meant to it does have that connection to MARC, so it doesn't have the complete granularity of MARC, but it has some of it, whereas Dublin Core is much more general. It does have a hierarchy, which allows for rich description, which is helpful for complex digital objects. And it is, by its nature, typically compatible with existing descriptions in large library databases like ILS. So typically mods is dependent upon your particular library catalog in your library, it would be useful or even possibly supported in your particular catalog. I know that Alma, which is an Ex Libris product, does support mods sort of it just as its own as a function. So although most Alma catalogs are going to be in a MARC format, it does support mods and it publishes data and mods as well too. So an example of mods, and this is looking at it from the data standpoint. Of course, if we look at this, we see that XML stuff kind of all over the place, and we see the XML right up there at the top. We see that it tells us that this is XML version 1, and then we have an encoding associated with it. This is more of a Unicode thing that has to do with diacritics, so a character encoding versus file format. We've got that as XML, and it's XML using UFTF-8, which is a Unicode encoding. Now, do you need to know that last piece of it about Unicode? No, I just kind of, not for the purposes of this class. I will say that if you are moving data from one system to another, migrating, ingesting, importing, any of that kind of thing, then knowing that you have a system that supports Unicode or doesn't can be critical to getting those records in. So if you are at any point in the future, or maybe you've already done this and you wondered why it didn't work, if you're trying to import records or ingest records in and you're having a failure point in that ingest or import process, it could very well be Unicode. And that's probably one of the most common things that happens. Unicode is that character set, like the Arial character set that supports diacritics, things like the umlaut and acute and accents and all those kind of things. But it also has to do with how the characters themselves are actually encoded. It's more of a web thing, but where it impacts us is with the data imports and ingest. So moving data back and forth. So it gets very tricky. It can be all kinds of things, but that's another one of the things it can be. So again, if we look here at this list, we see title info, then we see names, we see various pieces from that list of those high level elements. So again, if you are looking at, maybe you're looking at a collection or a project that might be between a library catalog and between an archive in terms of what your collection is. You may be looking at finding aids, you may be looking at EAD for that piece of it, or if you don't have big collections, it's just a lot of individual items, then you may be looking more at mods as one of the things you would look at in terms of a metadata schema. That's not to say that would be your only choice, but that might be one that you would look at. MADS, I threw this one in here because it's kind of goes along with mods, and it's meant to be a derivative of MARC authorities, and it's used primarily for names. So this would be for name authorities. This really hasn't caught on outside of the library community at all, and I think the reason is that we're just sort of moving on to other file formats or even XML, and we're moving more towards linked data. So we're not looking at whether or not we need to include the actual text or text strings representing names. We're just looking at whether or not we can link to an authoritative source for our identity management. Now, do you need to worry about that for this particular class? Certainly, if you were developing a project and you're writing your best practices, one of the things you would be considering in your best practices is how you're going to apply some identity management for your names, for the people represented in your collections, and for the authors and creators and illustrators and donors and all the people who have participated and contributed to that resource in some way. So MADS would be one that would be of consideration. Since it's not really caught on outside as much as I would have hoped it would by now, then your software may or may not support it. But certainly it would be one to look at if you were doing, say, an institutional repository or maybe a digital humanities project where you have a lot of individual resources and you're wanting to find a way to put some identity management within that particular software. Again, you may just instead use whatever name element appears in your metadata schema, and then maybe you're just going to use linked data instead, and you're going to link out to Wikidata or link out to VIF or some other source. MADS elements, it's the basics for names, the person's title, the topic associated. It can be used for subject topics, but typically we're going to use those through the controlled vocabulary. So I would say MADS is probably very seldom used for that kind of thing, but it's really focused more, at least how MADS is currently applied in most places. It's mostly applied through individuals. Example of a MADS data, just so you can see, we have the person's name and we have name. And again, this is in an XML format. We see that it's XML right up there at the top. It actually has an XSL with, which is the spreadsheet, not spreadsheet, a style sheet associated with it, but it is all a form of the XML. So finally, to the one that's probably most commonly used across the most platforms. And a lot of times Dublin Core is used in software and it's not even sort of stated as being Dublin Core. It's just, you have a title field and then you have a creator field and you have a contributor and you have a place to record rights. And various projects will follow the Dublin Core elements without ever mentioning Dublin Core. So little diagram of the bibliographic description in Dublin Core, what the various elements would look like. So when you are working with metadata and you're working with it, especially at the code level, one of the things that you will see in the code level is you will see something like this where you have DC and then colon and creator. And so one of the things that we do when in most systems we'll do when we're creating data using a specific framework is that it will include a label about what that framework is for that particular element. Now you may say, but why does it need to put DC for every element? Why wouldn't it just say Dublin Core at the top and that's it? Well, one of the reasons why we do include that label for every element, and not all systems do this, but really all systems should do this, because with all these different metadata schemas, we can combine them together. So let's say that mods works really well for some of your resources, but you want to use VAR Core for your visual art stuff. You could put those two schemas together and pull out the pieces that work the best for your particular collection. Now, there's some challenges to that. One, your system, whatever software you use, has to be able to do that. That's probably your biggest hurdle to overcome. But if it can do that, then on the system side, you have to be able to tell the system, this is coming from mods, and this is coming from VAR Core. And how would the system know that? Well, the system would know that two different places. This DC and then the element that's telling it, the DC creator, it's telling it that creator is coming from the Dublin Core metadata schema. So it's telling the system right there in that information. But if we go up here, if we go back to our MADS example, we can see at the top up here, it has information about MADS. So we've told the system straight up, this is MADS. And then we actually give it a link to where the MADS is located, and then also a link to where information about the MADS data is located. So we've given the system a link that it can follow back to MADS so that it could see whatever it needs to see in terms of making sense of this. Now you may say, in this case, there's not anything here saying like MDS name part and things like that. That's true. And this is a very simplified version of a MADS record anyway. But because this only represents MADS, it doesn't represent anything else, we don't really need to define each element as MADS because everything here is MADS. But if we did have a system that could allow us to include multiple schemas together, which really is how schemas are meant to be used, to be able to work together and to extend the data to fully represent the resources we have, to be able to essentially almost build our own schema by customizing and curating based upon the schemas that are acceptable. In that case, when we start using multiple schemas together, we very much, for the purposes of helping the system, having the prefix, as it's called, is very helpful. And for those of you who may be looking at BibFrame records, BibFrame being the potential replacement for MARC, when you look at actual coding of a BibFrame record, you see the data output, not the sort of pretty record that we would see in a public display, but you see the actual data. You will see the BF prefix, and that is to tell the system that this is a BibFrame element. So this is a common standard practice across metadata schemas and across programming, and it's very, very helpful when we combine things together. Dublin Core is a little bit of an interesting thing because it's evolved over time. There is a qualified Dublin Core set that added 3 elements beyond the original set. So it added audience provenance and rights holder. And it also added some additional basic refinements. Since that qualified Dublin Core set came out, it's the whole Dublin Core, essentially this, has been turned into classes and properties, which we talked a little bit more about how classes group properties together and things like that. We talked a little bit about that in the vocabulary terminology section. So in terms of Dublin Core, it is widely accepted. It's easy to read. It's easy to work with. It was very much embraced early on in the web community, and then it's sort of just lost. It's sort of fallen out of popularity, I think, with the larger web community. They sort of moved on to schema.org, but it can be used by other schemas, and it is mostly compatible with MARC. So if we want to move records back and forth between our library catalog and some other system, Dublin Core can also do that work. Now, is mods better? Yes, mods would be better in that situation, but not a lot of the software support mods as far as the non-library software. You're more likely to have Dublin Core support being supported in these other software. But it does have some lack of data refinement and especially granularity that can cause some loss of information. So it takes a little bit of work to convert it to MARC, but it's certainly doable if that is something down the road that you would need to do. You don't need to do that for this class. Just kind of trying to get to the interoperability of how these things can work together. The other thing I will say about Dublin Core is that it does have Coming out of a non-MARC community, I do think it has more focus on things like audience and provenance and rights holder than a traditional library catalog or MARC record has had. So I do think there's some advantages to Dublin Core over MARC at times. MARC does have the ability to represent that data in a lot of those fields now. There's been more fields added for provenance, but that was not true in the early days of MARC, whereas qualified Dublin Core has been around for quite a long time now. Here's an example of um, a Dublin Core, and actually this gets a little bit to mapping. So when we start talking about mapping, I may use this example again, but Dublin Core in the Content DM software. So we have our field name is title, and that's the field name that is in Content DM. So that is the software name that is in Content DM as title. The Dublin Core title is, sorry, the Dublin Core name is also title. So in this case, it's easy. And the type of data that we're entering is text. So we're not entering a link. We are going to be entering text. There's some other things here where we can choose whether or not you want it searchable and whether or not you want it to be hidden and whether or not it's a required value, things like that, whether or not there's a vocabulary associated with it. So, there's a little bit more going on to this besides just being a Dublin Core example, but it is a good example of looking at a core list of Dublin Core elements and then how they would map or match up to a software's names. And in some cases, because Content DM is from OCLC, so that's sort of that's a library adjacent community and a community that we interact with as librarians a lot with OCLC. And so it makes sense that their mapping, their field names would be very compatible with Dublin Core. I do not think it supports mods yet as far as Content DM, but it's been a little while since I've worked in Content DM, so just don't quite remember. But it has been growing, and this was sort of the state of Dublin Core in 2000, which again, as I said, it's been around for a while. And one of the things I do like about this particular diagram is it breaks things down into the elements and then the various refinements, and then it breaks things down into the codings and types. So if you are a person that is going to be looking at Dublin Core, it really is okay to look at some of this older material related to Dublin Core. Title still title, creator still creator, contributor still contributor. And if it's a little bit easier to use the more simplified version of Dublin Core, then that's perfectly okay with me, because I do think it's a little bit easier to apply. And my experience working with a lot of projects that use Dublin Core is that they do use the 15 element set. Although they may link to Dublin Core with the classes and properties that has a little bit more, the fields that appear in the work forms are the 15 elements. So it's okay with me if you go look for older documentation of Dublin Core. And some of the older documentation of Dublin Core does appear on the Dublin Core website. So it's still there. It's not that it's entirely obsolete, because there are projects out there that are still using that 15 core set. There are projects out there that probably use even the earliest Dublin Core version. So you will still see that represented, although it will direct you to the newer forms of Dublin Core. The elements and qualifications have more or less stayed the same since the early days. They've just added to things, and they have rearranged the Dublin Core class. They've rearranged Dublin Core elements into classes and properties. Terminology's changed just a little bit, but I think it's pretty easy to kind of work out where the terminology has changed when you look at them. So I'm okay with you using an older version of Dublin Core if you want to use the qualified set. If that works for your particular project, that's okay with me, because you need to be able to look at the elements and make those recommendations for what's going to be mandatory and what's not going to be mandatory. Now, if you start looking at the Dublin Core 15 element set, and that's not going to work for you, then you certainly could take a look at the classes and properties in the newer one to see where things have expanded a little bit to see whether or not that helps, or you may need to look at another schema entirely. And that's part of the purposes of doing this evaluation, is to look at the schemas and make those kind of decisions. VRA Core. This is Dublin Core like. It looks a lot like Dublin Core to me, but it's really designed for image collections and visual arts materials. So if you're looking at VRA Core, you are going to see much more granular elements and field/elements for visual arts related materials. Can it work with other schemas? Yes, it can. And we already had the conversation, talked a little bit about how schemas can work together. Definitely, if you have visual arts materials, I would take a look at that one to see if that will work for you. It is similar in Dublin Core, same negatives, that it has a lack of data refinement. So in some places it's very granular, in other places it's kind of broad. And so that's the broad areas is where we really start running into potential issues. So things you may see in a VAR core element set. You'll see things like material, where it talks about the material and technique that's used for a particular work. Style and period and culture. So it does get to some areas that, things we think of when we're looking at cultural objects and especially visual arts objects. So it may be applicable to other projects besides just visual arts materials. So don't just rule it out because you think, well, maybe it's not going to work. It does get to some of these other things that are more cultural oriented. So it may be worth a consideration. Here's an example of the VAR core element set. This is just kind of mapping an example. We're going to talk more about mapping in a couple of weeks from now, so I don't want to get too much into mapping, but I did want to kind of start giving you some snippets of what mapping documentation looks like. One of the most common mapping documentation formats is probably using a spreadsheet. Doesn't have to be very it doesn't have to be anything fancy. A spreadsheet works really, really well for this because we're talking about what the element is in our metadata schema and then how it fits with other particular things and whether or not there is a standard applied to it. So just an example. So choosing an appropriate schema. Well, we have some choices here, but hopefully you're starting to get some ideas of things to look at. And again, do not feel limited by these things I'm suggesting here, because there's much more out there. And, I know of some other things out there. We haven't covered everything in today's session by any means. That's even in some of the charts that I showed earlier. So if there's something on there that looks of interest to you, go ahead and take a look at it and evaluate it to see if it works for your project, because that's the purpose of this, is to look at your particular project and look at the scope and format, the scope of the project, the format of the resources in your project, as well as the subjects represented. Subjects will probably be more looking at the controlled vocabularies, but looking at the project as a whole to determine which metadata schema is going to work best. And it may be, if you're really struggling between two, then it may be that you're going to consider, whether or not they can work together and things like that. But you can talk to me about that too, if you're kind of on the fence about, well, which one's better for this particular project. We're not going to talk too much about crosswalking today. Crosswalking is just, we'll talk more about it in the future, but we have touched a little bit on mapping. So I wanted to talk a tiny bit about crosswalking and then kind of wrap up with a little bit more about XML. So crosswalking is really to allow different systems to talk to one another and to share data. I mean, that's really the purpose of doing it. It helps to break down data transfer barriers. Different systems can share data between themselves, and to be able to combine metadata catalogs. So being able to combine different data streams together. It can also help facilitate searching across databases. So what we sometimes call federated search, that's kind of an old term, but cross-searching or searching between unlike databases can make data maintenance more efficient. And in theory, if we can crosswalk data more, then we could possibly save some time in technical services processing and metadata work. I don't know that I necessarily believe that. Everything that seems to be said as being more efficient and will help us seems like it costs more money and takes more time. This is another example. This is one of my examples or not my examples, this was from a real project. And again, this was a mapping guide, and then it had not only the element, it had the term that we were applying, whether or not it was required or not, scope note to give a little bit more information to the person using it, pretty extensive instructions. So best practices were quite extensive. Best practices built on RDA. So for those of you who are catalogers, you'll probably recognize some of that. And then some examples, and then what the DCMI, because I was using DCMI and the classes and properties versus just the 15 element set, what the choice would be there. And then because we were going to import or map these into MARC, then what the options would be for that. Now, for this particular example, you notice that the elements creator, and if you look all the way to the right, the MARC fields list 3 different MARC fields. You know, there's one of the examples of not having data that's granular enough to be able to clearly parse data. So we have an example of a field that could go, and actually it could go even into more fields besides this one, but with our particular data in this particular collection, our only choices were going to be 100, 110, and 111. So essentially the persons. So we could have an individual person, we could have a group of people, or we could have meeting or conferences in our creators. And there's just not enough information on the Dublin core side to clearly communicate to a system. So at some point in the mapping process, and we did not get fully through all of our mapping work, but the idea was that we would just map everything into the first MARC field, which would be the 100 field, and then we would go in and do some retrospective data cleanup. You know, and that's the choice to make, because there's no easy way. There's not enough criteria on the Dublin core side to be able to clearly define what that is. Now, could we have done that work before migration? And certainly I'm a fan of cleaning up what you can before migration. Yes, that was another option too. We were going to compare our authorities, our identities, that were in the library catalog to what was in this particular project. So the hope was that we would be able to clean up some of that possibly in the import process. And we did some tests that went fairly well, but certainly not perfect. So as we wrap up here, what about file formats and encoding? How do we put a schema into action? Well, this is where we really look to XML. XML is not the only way, but I will just say it is the way. It is the way. XML is the way. It is a standard for this kind of work. So if you are doing any of this work, maybe you're doing it now or you're going to be doing it in the future, you will be encountering XML in some way. You may be getting files in XML. You may be sending files in XML. You may be setting up harvesting protocols. You may be looking at XML itself. You may be doing cleanup and having to do it directly in the XML versus using some kind of tool within your system. So how much you may have to interact with XML will really depend upon the system you're working in and what your job is. You may not have to see XML at all, except when you get that file to put it into your system, you may notice that that file says it's XML, and that's really all you really worry about with XML because you import it into your system and it's just fine. Hopefully you're getting a sense of how XML fits into all of this. So it does not specify what those elements are. That's the metadata schema that we just looked at. It does not say what content goes into those particular fields. That's going to be our best practices, and that's going to be our controlled vocabularies for our subjects. It really just specifies how elements should be tagged at the file format level. So it's talking about data at the file format level. So it is a data carrier. So for example, our element names, how are element names represented in that data file? Do they have brackets? Do they start and end? What is the structure of those fields or elements? So that's what XML and any markup language typically does, is it tells the system how to mark up or handle this data. So XML is really the key to all of that interoperability stuff. I mean, yes, we want the fields. It's easier if our fields match up. So when we looked at the content DM example, and it was the content DM field was title, and the Dublin core field value was title, its element was title to title. That's easy for a system to understand, right? There's no ambiguity. I'm getting tongue-tied. Anyway, it's not ambiguous. It is straightforward that that's what it is. So there's nothing there for it to not understand or to misrepresent. XML is that protocol piece of it. So that's the piece of it that facilitates the actual data transfer. So if we have Dublin core and we have our metadata schema, and we're going to say we're going to put data into content DM, we'd create a mapping table that would say title to title. That's an easy one because it's just exactly what it is in both systems. So that's an easy one. But then the structure of that data would be the XML piece of it. So XML is not tied to any one schema or platform. It is agnostic of everything. It can be used with Mark, Dublin Core, mods. Talked about a lot of things. XML is used with apps on our phone. I mean, XML is just used for so much contact information and contact, in our little contacts in our phones and our email and things like that. XML is used in our email. XML is used in authentication. So when our name and like our name information is sent forward, that's typically going in an XML. So XML is just everywhere. It's just everywhere. And it is modular. So it's modular and standardized units of data. We already talked about how things can be extensible. XML is the same way. We talked a little bit about Mark XML the last time, so I'm not going to really talk too much about that, but certainly that is something that makes XML very appealing, that it can help us get out of this structure that isn't really compatible with other systems and other structures outside of kind of our Mark landscape. Harvesting, ingesting protocols, we already talked about that. APIs typically use XML or incorporate XML in that. I think we looked at this before where we talked about how the tags start. So of course, this is not a Dublin core example. I'll show you one in just a second, but it starts with a tag. We have the element name, the attribute, and then we have the value within that attribute. I have our content value, which would be our descriptive metadata. And then once we finish with our content value, our descriptive metadata, then we turn off all of that. So we say this greeting field starts, all the pieces of that greeting field, and then we put our content in there, which is hello world, and then we say this field ends. So unlike Mark or some other types of metadata, when we have things that are in XML format, we have to have the field starts and the field ends. So it does make it much clearer to systems in terms of how information is presented and where field information starts and begins. I've already mentioned marking up already, but marking up is just that use of tags. So it's marking up, it's adding the opening tag, and then that closing tag is the tag with the backward slash. So I think of it as open and close. Open starts the field. We do our field stuff with our metadata value in it, and then we turn it all off. So title, turn the title on, start the title, the brown bear, and then backward slash with the brackets turns it all off. This is a pretty good example, and you may want to spend a little bit of time looking at it. This is one that I found a long time ago that I've kept. It is a sort of an example, and it breaks down like how the element of a book. So thinking about element, of course, this isn't Dublin Core or anything, but thinking about element as book, and then attributes would be the value of it, and then the various pieces of that, and then how it would sort of be mapped in a more visual presentation. So this would be similar to taking this sort of approach, but making it more of a visual kind of tree example. There's a lot of examples if you're really interested in like the format and structure of XML. There's a lot of really good examples in the W3C in the XML documentation. And if you're interested, we're not doing too much with that XML. I don't want anybody to think this is a coding class because that's not what we're doing, not this class. But there are really good examples in the W3C XML section, and I'll post that as an announcement so that people can easily find it. So that's all we wanted to talk about with XML. It's a communication standard. You can think of it as a file format as well because it does serve that purpose too. XML, Mark XML, METs can fall into this category too. You can also think of them as containers for data. So we looked at METs a little bit in terms of the fact that METs has different kinds of metadata associated with it, but I didn't really talk too much about what METs was other than just to tell you that it was a metadata encoding and transmission standard. But now that we've talked about XML and we've talked about schemas and we've talked about data carriers and all of that, then this hopefully makes a little bit more sense to you in terms of what METs actually is. So METs does include bits of descriptive metadata. And so that would be our resource description. It contains structural metadata, and it includes then some administrative metadata. And then that is all wrapped up in terms of that METs encoding and transmission standard. Now, can METs be used with Dublin Core? Sure. And can it be used with Primus, which is a preservation schema? Sure. So METs can be used with a lot of different things out there. So, METs it's another one of those things where we've just not used it as much as I think we could have, but it's meant to be an XML schema designed for the purposes of creating that hierarchy, and especially for digital library objects, and to be able to address like names and locations of files and the relationships better. It is often used with mods, and again, mods is not highly used outside of library communities and sometimes with Dublin Core, but it's just one of those things that I just don't think we've used enough of. Again, this is a little breakdown just to kind of show you what a structure would look like in terms of the code, where you'd have the beginning of the METs, and then you have the description piece of the METs, and then you have the administrative piece, and then you kind of turn everything off at the end of it. And that's just a very simplified example, but it follows that same markup structure that we would see in XML. Again, this is just, like I said, a super, super simplified version to kind of show the descriptive administration and that technical, or what they call file section and structure. So file section and structure being technical metadata there. One of the things that's really interesting about METs is that there are already what they call sockets, or sometimes they're called METs wrappers. And these are schemas that are used to work or plug into METs. And there's a bunch of them. There's one for mods, Dublin Core, Mark XML, Mix, TextMD, and I'm sure there's some other ones besides that. So there were attempts to try to make METs more to work with all of these other schemas out there. And you may think, well, why would you just not use, if you're going to use METs, then why would you just not use METs? Well, the reason why is because there's just not a lot here, especially for resource description. So if I want to use METs, I'm not going to be able to include a whole lot of information about the resource itself without pulling in Dublin Core, or without pulling in mods, or one of the others that it would work with. So I think that's also part of why METs has just not gained a lot of popularity, because it is very limited in the resource description piece of it, which of course is one of the pieces that we want to focus on the most. As one of the final things I'm going to show you here, this is a structure and syntax in Dublin Core. And this one gets to some of the things we've already talked about, where at the top, there's the XML version, so it tells the system that it's XML. And if we were to look at this entire record, we see the XML at the top. Now that string at the top, that's the brackets with the XML version information. That's, even with web coding, there's some information that appears right at the top of the coding for websites that tells systems what format that particular data is in. So that's a typical approach to, or a typical part of just web content and data content of all types. And then we have information, then the next pieces of it, and we see this with HTML too across the web, where we tell the system then, okay, we tell you what file format, what data carrier we're using. In the case of HTML, for websites, it would be HTML, and what version it is. For XML, we would tell it what version of XML it was, and then we're going to give it more information by linking to the various resources for the particular XML or Dublin Core that we're going to be using. So in this particular example, there is information there that we're using where the schema is located at. So we have some information about the XML, and then we have the XML itself, and then we have information then about the schema location. So we are directing the system back to where it can find information about the schema. And that's standard across the web environments too, where we're directing the system, or providing the system kind of reference material almost within the coding to tell the system what version of XML or what version of whatever web programming language a particular thing is in. So we tell it that, and then we also tell it information about where to go find information about what we're going to be using further along. So in this case, we are telling it where it can go for the actual schema, And then we're going to actually tell it where to go directly for the element set. So we're going to tell it to go to Dublin Core, and we're going to tell it to go to the element set that's Dublin Core 1.1. And we give it the link to go directly to that. Then we're also going to tell it which terms we're using, that we're using the Dublin Core terms. So we're going to tell it that. So we're going to give it very specific information before we even start our metadata kind of piece of it. We're going to give it information about exactly what we are using in terms of constructing this. Now, would you ever have to write Dublin Core as code? Probably not unless you just want to do it for fun. You're more than likely you're going to use some kind of software that would use Dublin, that would create Dublin Core, and you would just fill in the title and the creator and the subjects and all those kind of things. If you were able to use linked data, then you would use links. You would see links that would appear then possibly within the data that you're looking at on the work form, but you would definitely see it on the data view or on the code view. So here we see for the DC terms, URI, we see that it's linking to for identifier, we see that it's linking to DC terms URI, which means it's going to use a URI for that or link data. And we see then it's linking out to that. So just a little snapshot of sort of what Dublin Core could look like in terms of seeing it in the XML presentation. Again, that is not going to be the view that you're typically going to see, but it is an XML. And if for some reason you maybe needed to go in and work with the data itself, that is what you would actually see. Typically, you're going to see a work form that says title and creator, and just like we did with the archives space examples we looked at earlier. So Dublin Core and other schemas can be expressed in XML. That's probably one of the most common that they can express in. As you are looking at your metadata schemas and thinking about what will work for your projects, another thing to think about is when you're looking at the structure, you're looking at the field or property or class, whatever they call the field like thing, the elements. Are there assumptions that are made about the data or about the relationships between the data based upon those elements? Are there areas within that schema that have some bias that are sort of baked into it, that are included into it? Are there assumptions about the data in terms of the relationships of the fields? And if so, how are you going to deal with that? And let's see, I think I'm going to go back. And on that note, as you are thinking about your project, do you think about how the structure of the schemas you're looking at, and especially the schema that you may choose to work with for your project? Think about the structure of the relationships of the data, the fields, elements, properties, classes represented, whatever it may call those things. And think about whether or not there are areas where bias are baked in, or there are assumptions about the data that are made. And in those cases, how would you handle those? Or what would you do with those? Would you omit those fields? Would you make those fields optional? Would you choose to maybe use another schema for that information? How would you handle that particular piece of it? And you may find that with schemas, there's less of that than with controlled vocabularies, but it's something to certainly be aware of, especially if you're looking at a very niche schema that may be used for just a particular group. Does it suffice for your target audience, and does it suffice for the to facilitate search for these resources? The other thing to think about is that we are starting to look at how we can use linked data more. I mean, we have been looking at that for a while, but to think about that in terms of how that may work with your best practices for your schema. So would you have a particular standard as part of your choice for an element? Would that standard perhaps be use a URI, so use a link? So especially for subjects and names, that was fairly easy, but are there other areas? Location, if you have a schema that has location in it, would you use a controlled vocabulary, or would you point it to a controlled vocabulary that has URIs so that you can link directly to those? And in that case, then the recommendation as part of your schema may be to use URIs for specific fields. So as you are looking at your schemas, just a few things to think about in terms of what the standard should be for the particular field, in addition to whether or not it should be mandatory or optional. You may even have things on there that you're just going to omit, that you're not going to include them. And then if you find, in looking at your schema, where you find areas where you feel that either there's fields or elements are lacking or reflect a specific bias or somehow an assumption that is not going to help facilitate search for these particular resources, then how would you address that in terms of looking at your schemas? And on that note, we will see you next week and we'll continue this conversation. Thank you. Have a good week.